A significant shift is underway in the long-standing trade relationship between the United States and Mexico, centered on a staple of kitchens and restaurants across America, the fresh tomato. On April 14, 2025, the United States Department of Commerce made a pivotal announcement. The department declared its intention to withdraw from the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement. That pact had governed the terms of tomato trade for years. It paved the way for reintroducing significant tariffs on Mexican tomato imports. That sets a new and uncertain course for a multi-billion-dollar industry. A tariff of 20.91% will apply to the majority of fresh tomatoes entering the US from Mexico. According to an April 2025 economic impact analysis conducted by Texas A&M AgriLife Research, Mexican tomato imports have consistently accounted for a staggering 90 to 93% of all fresh tomatoes shipped into the United States. This isn't just a matter of preference. It is a structural dependency built over decades of integrated supply chains. In total, Mexico's tomato exports to the United States are valued at approximately $2.8 billion annually. Who have invested heavily in greenhouse technology and sophisticated logistics to meet the rigorous demands of the American market. These imports ensure that grocery store shelves remain stocked with a variety of tomatoes. The United States domestic growing season cannot single-handedly meet this relentless demand year-round. Mexican producers fill the critical gaps, particularly during the winter months when United States production wanes, ensuring that the supply chain remains unbroken and consumers have access to the fresh produce they expect. This deep integration means that any disruption, such as a sudden and significant tariff, cannot be easily absorbed. The new tariffs directly challenge this established system, forcing every player in the supply chain to recalculate their costs. The question is not whether there will be an impact, but rather how severe it will be and who will ultimately bear the financial brunt of this major trade policy shift. With the flow of Mexican tomatoes facing a significant new cost barrier, the natural question for American distributors: can they find alternative sources? Can anyone fill the impending void? The reality, replacing Mexico's sheer volume is monumental, maybe impossible. Lance Jungmeyer, president of the Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, warns of logistical challenges. Some importers might pivot to other countries, but those options are severely limited in scale. One often cited alternative: Canada. Canada's output is a fraction of Mexico's. You could shift some supply to Canada, yet that would only cover a small slice of demand. Beyond North America, the Caribbean, or suppliers even further afield, those options present major hurdles. Longer shipping times raise spoilage risk for fresh tomatoes. Logistics from those regions aren't as developed or efficient as Mexico's trucking routes, but you're never going to get that sheer volume supporting the US market. Mexico's scale is the defining feature. Experts say, no quick fix, no easy substitute. The US depends on Mexico for over 90% of imported fresh tomatoes. That dependency leaves very little flexibility. Other countries can serve niche markets or offer a small buffer, but they lack the capacity, infrastructure, and proximity to replace the millions of tons crossing the US-Mexico border each year. That leaves American businesses in a precarious spot, largely unable to source comparable volumes and forced to face higher costs to keep trading with Mexican partners. In the face of renewed tariff pressure from the United States, the Mexican government and its tomato producers did not remain passive. Drawing on experience from past trade disputes, they moved to implement a strategic measure aimed at appeasing United States concerns and, ideally, regaining full, tariff-free access to their primary market. In a decree published in the Federal Gazette, the Mexican government announced that it would establish official minimum prices for all fresh tomatoes destined for export to the United States. This proactive step was a direct attempt to counter the allegations of dumping. The logic behind this move is straightforward. By setting a mandatory price floor, Mexico aims to prevent its tomatoes from being sold in the United States market at prices that American growers deem unfairly low. The government's official statement clarified that the goal was to avoid generating a distortion in the prices of its tomato exports. This measure is essentially a form of self-regulation, designed to demonstrate a commitment to fair trade practices and undermine the rationale for the anti-dumping duties. This strategy is not entirely new. The now terminated Tomato Suspension Agreement operated on a similar principle, with Mexican signatories agreeing to abide by reference prices to avoid anti-dumping investigations. By unilaterally reimposing a price floor system, Mexico is signaling its willingness to return to a similar arrangement. It is a diplomatic and economic maneuver intended to reopen negotiations and restore the stability that the suspension agreement provided. The hope is that this gesture of goodwill might persuade the United States Commerce Department to reconsider its decision and return to a managed trade system rather than a confrontational one based on high tariffs. However, the effectiveness of this strategy remains uncertain. While setting minimum prices directly addresses the core complaint of dumping, it does not guarantee that the United States will lift the newly imposed tariffs. Therefore, they may view Mexico's latest move with skepticism, pushing for the tariffs to remain in place as a more reliable enforcement mechanism. As the lucrative United States market becomes more expensive to access, Mexican tomato growers are naturally exploring other export destinations to mitigate their potential losses. Canada, as the third partner in North American trade, presents itself as the most logical and immediate alternative. There is already a healthy trade relationship between the two countries, with a steady flow of agricultural goods moving in both directions. In 2024, according to data from the United Nations Comtrade database, Canada's imports of fresh or chilled tomatoes from Mexico were valued at approximately $310.33 million. This existing channel provides a foundation upon which to build. However, a closer look at the numbers reveals the stark limitations of this Canadian lifeline. While $310 million is a substantial figure, it pales in comparison to the nearly $2.8 billion worth of tomatoes that Mexico sells to the United States each year. The Canadian market currently absorbs only about 11% of the value of what the United States market does. This disparity in scale means that even a significant increase in exports to Canada would offset only a small fraction of the revenue at risk from the United States tariffs. Canada simply does not have the population size or the market demand to absorb the vast quantity of tomatoes that Mexico is accustomed to shipping north. For Mexican producers, this reality is sobering. While they will undoubtedly seek to strengthen their trade ties with Canada and increase their market share there, it cannot be a replacement for the United States. The challenge is not just about finding buyers, but about the sheer volume of their output. The Mexican tomato industry has been scaled and optimized over decades to serve the massive American consumer base. Pivoting this gigantic operation toward a market that is nearly 10 times smaller is not a viable long-term strategy. The best they can hope for is to use Canada as a partial hedge against the financial impact of the United States tariffs. Therefore, while news headlines might suggest a dramatic shift where Mexico ditches the United States for Canada, the economic data paints a more nuanced picture. The Canadian market can offer a small amount of relief, but it cannot rescue the industry from the profound challenges posed by a 20.91% tariff on its largest customer. Beyond the macroeconomic data, and tomato tariffs have a real and immediate impact on the lives of business owners and their employees. For many small and medium-sized enterprises in the United States, particularly in the restaurant industry, a sudden spike in the cost of a core ingredient can be devastating. Teresa Razzo, the owner of 2 Argentine Italian restaurants in Southern California, voiced this fear. Her businesses rely heavily on fresh tomato sauces. Salads toppings are now facing a financial crisis. The tariffs, she explained, could be the final blow to her already slim profit margins. Her warning was dire and unequivocal, highlighting the precarious position of many in the food service sector.
I give it 3 months and then we go bankrupt.
Capturing the sense of desperation felt by entrepreneurs who see their livelihoods threatened by a decision made hundreds of miles away in Washington, D.C. This is not a distant economic theory for her. It is a direct threat to the businesses she has built and the jobs she provides. Her restaurants, like thousands of others, operate on a model that assumes a stable and affordable supply of essential ingredients, a foundation that has now been shaken by the reintroduction of tariffs. The tariffs, which were pegged at around 17% to 21%, translate directly into higher operating costs. For a pizzeria, a taqueria, or an Italian restaurant, tomatoes are not an optional ingredient that can be easily substituted. They are fundamental. Business owners like Razzo are now faced with a difficult choice: absorb the increased cost and watch their profits evaporate, or pass the cost on to their customers and risk driving them away. For Teresa Razzo and countless others like her, the tomato tariff is not just a headline. It is an existential threat. The financial pressure felt by restaurant owners like Teresa Razzo is just one part of a much broader ripple effect that will inevitably reach the American consumer. When a 20.91% tariff is placed on over 90% of imported fresh tomatoes, the cost increase must be absorbed somewhere. Importers and distributors will pass at least a portion of this new expense onto their customers' grocery stores, restaurant suppliers, food service companies. In turn, these businesses will face the same difficult decision, either shrink their own margins or raise the prices they charge to the end consumer. The most likely outcome is a combination of both, leading to higher prices at the checkout counter and on restaurant menus. For American families, this means the cost of a seemingly simple purchase is set to increase: a pound of fresh tomatoes for a salad, a can of crushed tomatoes for pasta sauce. While the exact price hike will vary by region and retailer, the upward pressure is undeniable. Grocers will have to pay more for their inventory, and that cost will be reflected in the sticker price. This impacts household budgets, particularly for families already struggling with food inflation. What was once an affordable and healthy staple becomes a more expensive item, potentially forcing consumers to make different choices or reduce their consumption of fresh produce. The impact extends beyond just fresh tomatoes. The tariffs will also affect processed tomato products, ketchup, salsa, pizza sauces, pasta sauces. This could manifest as higher menu prices. Furthermore, beyond just price increases, there is a risk of supply disruptions that will be felt by millions of American households and businesses. Compounding the challenges posed by the new United States tariffs is a troubling trend in Mexico's agricultural sector: a decline in tomato production. According to forecasts for 2025, Mexico is expected to produce 3.1 million metric tons of tomatoes. This figure represents a 3% decrease compared to the output from 2024. The primary driver of this decline is persistent and widespread drought conditions in key growing regions. The combination of lower production and higher tariffs is creating a double bind for Mexican growers. With a smaller harvest to begin with, the financial impact of the 20.91% anti-dumping duty becomes even more acute. Total tomato exports from Mexico for 2025 are now forecast to be 1.96 million metric tons, a 5% drop from the previous year. A significant portion of this decline is expected to come from reduced shipments to the United States. Projections indicate that exports to the United States will fall to 1.83 million metric tons, as producers are forced to adjust their business models to account for the new tariff-related costs, which may make some shipments unprofitable. This confluence of factors paints an uncertain picture for the future of the North American tomato trade. For Mexico, the path forward involves navigating both environmental and economic headwinds. Growers must contend with water scarcity while simultaneously finding ways to remain competitive in a United States market that is now significantly more expensive to enter. The strategy of setting minimum export prices is an attempt to address the trade dispute, but it does not solve the underlying problem of a shrinking harvest. The industry's long-term stability depends on both a resolution to the tariff issue and a sustainable solution to its water challenges. For the United States, consumers and businesses are now facing the prospect of higher prices and potentially tighter supplies. For Canada, there may be an opportunity to import more Mexican tomatoes, but its market cannot absorb the full impact of the United States trade shift. What happens next will depend on ongoing negotiations, the resilience of supply chains, and the unpredictable forces of nature itself.